The data I'll be using is simply a list of numbers, including duplicates. I start out by turning the list into a named range, which I can then open in powerquery. From here, I select the Keep Rows button and select the Keep Duplicates option. This removes all non-duplicated values. Afterwards, I click the Group By button and select to group based on column 1, selecting the Count Rows operator. Finally, I sort the count column based on descending values. I'll insert a completely normal pivot table without adding it to the data model. Once again, I can use a named range as my source. I add my one field to both the row and values area, and then I change the summarize values by to be count instead of sum. With this method, I don't get a pivot table filter directly on my values column. Instead, I can click on the cell to the right of my column header and add a normal filter. At this point, we can simply filter out the value 1 in the count column. This will filter the rows of the spreadsheet, which can accidentally hide rows with data. You'd want to put the pivot table on its own sheet. This time, when I insert the pivot table, I add it to the data model by selecting the check mark. The data model allows us to do more operations with the pivot table. But right now, all I need is that I can filter on the values instead of just on the row label. Notice how the data model pivot table has the value filters, while the normal pivot table only has number filters. I simply have to add a values filter that only selects the rows where the value is greater than 1. This filter only applies to the rows in the table and not the rows in the spreadsheet. This means we only show certain rows of the table, but we show all rows in the sheet. This macro will have to be a sub-procedure and not a function, since I have to return an array. This also means you can't call it like a normal function inside Excel. I want the macro to assume that I've already selected the selection that I want to count duplicates on. If the user has only selected one cell, they'll get an input box asking them to make a selection. When I use the application.inputBox function instead of the normal inputBox function, I can decide what type I expect to return. So type 8 means I expect to return a range of cells. I create two arrays, one where I load in the values of my selection and one where I add in all of the duplicates as well as the count of duplicates. I loop through my original array and use the COUNTIF function to see if there are duplicates. I add two helper variables to make sure I don't double count a duplicate and to make sure I start at the beginning of my excluded array, which in this case is my duplicated array. My do while not is empty loop stops my loop once there are no more values inside the excluded array. If I can find the value inside my excluded array, it means I've already counted it, and I set my already counted variable to be equal to 1, and I end the loop. This means I don't have to add it to the excluded array since it's already there. If the value is a duplicate and it hasn't already been added, then the already counted variable is 0. At that point, I add it to the next row in my excluded array. I also add the count to the second column of my array, meaning how many times has this number come up inside my original data. Now I'm ready to print the excluded array into Excel. I use the application.inputBox method like before. I add a check to see if the top left cell in the print range has values already. If so, I want you to select another range. I use the goToLabel method in order to force you to go back up to the beginning before the input box. This effectively creates an infinite loop until the user has selected a range where the top left cell is empty. Once the user has selected a valid range, that range is resized to be equal to the size of the duplicated array, and at that point I simply set that range to be equal to the array. If I only select the one cell when I run the macro, it'll tell me to select a whole range of cells. If you've already selected a range of cells, you'll simply be asked where to print the array. You can add the macro to the ribbon in order to make it easier to call it. You go to Customize Ribbon, Macros, and then you have to add a new group to whatever tab you want. And then you can add it. You can also add a shortcut key by going to Macros, clicking on the macro, clicking Options, and then adding the shortcut key. You need to make sure you don't override an existing shortcut.